The Cambridge Dictionary defines golden era as a period of time when something or someone was particularly successful, good, or special. And it got me thinking, what's Pokemon's golden era? Now, I'm sure everyone has different definitions of eras, and there's a few ways to look at it, and even sub-eras to complicate things even farther, but the simplest way we can define era is by console. Here on my whiteboard, we have the Game Boy / Game Boy Color era, which is all the Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon games, ending with Pokemon Crystal version, of course. I know technically it's Game Boy Color and Crystal is not on the original Game Boy, but still the Game Boy era. Could also be seen as the Retro era or Stone Age era, since most of the games on here were released in a different millennium than the Game Boy Advance era, being all the GBA games, of course, Ruby Sapphire, Fire Red Leaf Green, and then Emerald, followed by the Nintendo DS era. Actually, I guess you could also consider XD, Gale of Darkness, and Colosseum in the GBA era because there are connectivity with those games, although side series won't be as much of a focus for this. And then again, with the DS era, we have a lot of games here. Diamond Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, Black and White 1, Black and White 2. I didn't put every single game, I'm not that crazy, I'm not going to put tape on every single one of my games, just like half of them, which is good. Then we have the 3DS era, which again, there's some confusion here. The 3DS and DS are different consoles. I get comments thinking that the 3DS is more like a DS Lite-esque console, like no, like yes, the 3DS plays DS games, but it has 3DS games only on the 3DS that don't work on the other one. Also, we're only looking on games that were released for that specific console. So yes, while the 3DS could technically have backwards compatibility to play Diamond or Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and while it can play like Red and Gold through the Virtual Console, we're only going by time period they were released. So in the 3DS era, it is 2013 to 2017, XY, Memory Alpha Sapphire, Sun and Moon, Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, and then for the Switch era, I ran out of room. I didn't want to tape everything. I ran out of tape too, so I just put them sideways over here. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee in 2018. Sword and Shield, which I didn't have room for. Scarlet and Violet. Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. Legends Arceus. And then Legends ZA. Again, no Fire Red and Leaf Green. Those are GBA games, not Switch games. Then I thought this was obvious, but the Game Boy Advance SP is literally a Game Boy Advance and counts the same as GBA for Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, and Leaf Green. That's it. There was some confusion in the YouTube poll saying like, oh, what about the SP? It's a Game Boy Advance. I did make a video a while ago about the best console to play main series Pokemon games on, and this isn't that video. We're trying to find the golden era of Pokemon, so let's start with the top, the Game Boy era. Starting with the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan for the original Game Boy, and finishing up with the release of Pokemon Crystal on the Game Boy Color. This was the start of Pokemon. This was arguably Pokemon's high in terms of overall popularity across every platform, and it's kind of what got everything going. I'm sure a lot of older Pokemon fans who start with Generation 1 and current have chronic knee and back pain will say it's the best era of Pokemon, as a big part of this topic is nostalgia. Actually, it's almost entirely nostalgia. And what you grew up with and just personal preference plays a big role in this, but to be honest, I don't think the Game Boy era is the golden era of Pokemon. Let's focus on the positive first, as every era has their positives, even you Generation 7, but we'll get to you later. I also think it's important to not only look back on the era and see how they stand up today, but also look at each era when they were new in the current era. By today's standards, playing Generation 1 Pokemon games is a bit of a hassle since you can't run, the bag space is very limited, there's some glitches, actually a lot of glitches, and overall the experience feels a lot less polished than even Generation 2, which released just a couple of years later. Out of every Pokemon game, they're the most annoying to go back and play, and the best way to play through Kanto isn't even on a Game Boy console. Or at least, not an original Game Boy console, as all original Game Boy models, even the Game Boy Color, which released nearly a decade after the original brick Game Boy, don't have a backlit screen, are annoying to play, and the original Game Boy didn't even have color. I want you to think about that for a second, since it never really gets brought up, but the first Pokemon games released in black and white, doesn't that make them seem a lot older than they actually are? I mean, I'm older than them too, but so is your mom, and she still looks great. And look, I know I'm beating a dead horsey talking about Gen 1 Pokemon graphics and how limited the experience is compared to newer Pokemon games, but these games set the foundation for every Pokemon game after it, and that's worth a lot. Even to this day, the original Gen 1 Pokemon games are the most iconic and most loved. Like, I even saw a post the other day, I think it was at Target, and they had like 12 Pokemon on it. They were all Gen 1 Pokemon, except for Togepi, which is like an honorary Gen 1 Pokemon, and then randomly Mudkip. I mean, I like Mudkip, But what are you doing here? This was also a point where the anime was by far the most popular it's ever been. Heck, the anime was so popular, they even released the Generation 1 games again and had it resemble Ash's adventure in the anime much more closely by giving you a Pikachu as a starter Pokemon, and still all 3 Kanto starters like Ash had, and the first default name in Yellow version is even Ash. Some people say you actually do play as Ash in Yellow version, and you don't, it's Red just like in the Red and Blue games and the manga, hence why they use the exact same sprite and why Ash doesn't appear anywhere on the box art or official art for Yellow version, but some people still comment saying no, it's actually Ash, kind of like how I get comments saying how the 2DS and 3DS are also different consoles because they have different libraries, which they don't. But continuing the Game Boy era with Generation 2, and wow, these are a huge upgrade. It feels like the Gen 2 games are the games Game Freak set out to make from the start, and this time they had the reputation from Generation 1 to back it up and do what they wanted. Now, it's common for newer Pokemon games to have cool features, then slowly have those features get removed or heavily altered over time, but with the Generation 2 Pokemon games, they just added so much to the Pokemon experience, especially the core experience, as a lot of those things are still in the game today. The bag is now less cluttered and has different pockets with more space and organization. The PC storage is a little bit better and you can actually see the Pokemon spread in your PC. As a kid playing Red version, I would just nickname my Pokemon like a ton of random letters, causing me to lose them in the PC, and this just makes it a lot easier. The PC system wouldn't be perfected until later on, but other than that, the Gen 2 games just had a lot of fun extra features we still see in Pokemon today. Held items, more ways to encounter Pokemon like headbutt trees, and of course, shiny Pokemon. I've talked about Generation 2 on the channel a lot lately, and I'll try to keep this brief, but introducing a day-night cycle, having different encounters at different times of the day, and even special events on certain days is really cool and a welcome feature to further immerse yourself in the Pokemon world. And yes, I'm aware that's a pretty cliche thing to say in a YouTube video, but while replaying Crystal version recently, I found myself playing at certain hours of the day and on certain days in order to complete certain tasks, and I even connected my game up to Stadium 2 almost every day for the daily mystery gift. Carrie just gives me useless mail or berries most of the time, but she can give you a room decoration item, and one of those is a Virtual Boy. I don't know why they bothered to program a Virtual Boy into a Pokemon game and not even program like a Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, but it's still cool. Maybe Game Boy sort of broken the third wall a little bit, but there are countless NPCs you can find in Pokemon games that hold Game Boys anyway, some of which can even trade Pokemon to you, and they have this animation that plays with 2 Game Boys, which I guess implies that the player does carry around a Game Boy on their adventure. And look, I'm getting off topic here, and you know what? While I'm off topic, I'll remind you to click that like button and subscribe because it helps a ton, and tell check out my Patreon because I started one recently and you can see some cool behind the scenes videos, probably like one on this one that's already out now. Also, typically the videos come out a day early, which is kind of nice. But to wrap up the Game Boy era of Pokemon, it's what started it all and laid the groundwork. Red and Blue were a blank canvas, and Gold and Silver set the standard for what every Pokemon game should be. But in my personal opinion, as well as the opinion of many people I've asked, and the opinion of you guys on that YouTube community poll, the Game Boy era is not the golden era. It's not bad by any means, it's just rather limited as there's only 2 generations. But now let's move on to Generation 3, where things are a bit more interesting in the GBA era. And I know I went off script and said Gen 1, or rather the GBA era, or rather the Game Boy era, only has 2 generations. So does the GBA era. Why did I say that? Now, one thing that's often overlooked with the Game Boy Advance era of Pokemon from the years 2003 to like 2007-ish is that this was actually a low point for Pokemon in terms of popularity. Ruby and Sapphire sold about half as many copies worldwide as Red and Blue, and about a third less than Gold and Silver, which is a pretty significant drop. I mean, it still accounts for over 16 million copies worldwide of Ruby and Sapphire, which is incredible, but nowhere near where it was in the Game Boy era. The anime wasn't quite as popular in the Advanced generation. Heck, even Pokemon cards were printed much less during the Gen 3 era, which is a big reason why Gen 3 era cards are so expensive nowadays, especially cards from the Fire Red and Leaf Green set. A lot of older Pokemon fans fell out of Pokemon at this time, and moving to a new console is never easy, but it certainly wasn't because Ruby and Sapphire were bad games. The Generation 3 Pokemon games were also like a soft reboot since they weren't compatible with the Generation 1 and Generation 2 Pokemon games on the Game Boy original because of how they overhauled how Pokemon stats and mechanics worked. I feel like if something like that happened today, World War III would break out, and not just because it's a crappy thing and it would be way worse now compared to back when there were only 3 generations of Pokemon, but because the internet would blow it out of proportion with low quality video essays complaining about how terrible that decision was, Kind of like this video, but a lot more negative. They did eventually remedy this by releasing Fire Red and Leaf Green to give access to all Generation 1 Pokemon on the Game Boy Advance system, as well as some Generation 2 Pokemon. Then Emerald version had some more Generation 2 Pokemon in the Safari Zone in the post-game. Then there's the GameCube games, Pokemon Colosseum, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, to add the rest of the Generation 2 Pokemon, which is how those side series games relate to this video. And to be honest, even though I love Ruby and Sapphire and the Gen 3 era as a whole, it was a step back in a lot of ways. One of Generation 2's defining features was time, which coincidentally ties into Celebi's lore very nicely, but having some sense of time gave you so much to do in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Daily events, nighttime only encounters, morning only encounters, and all that Ruby and Sapphire had to keep track of time was to grow your berries, although if your battery died, they just wouldn't grow anymore, and also it'll change the water level of the Shoal Cave, which is an optional area, and that's it. There is technically a day-night cycle in Ruby and Sapphire, although the lighting doesn't change like it did in Gen 2, and there's no time-specific encounters, so it just goes by whatever time you set your clock at during the start of the game, so if you accidentally evolve your Eevee into Espeon in reversion at 9 PM, that's on you. And then with Fire Red and Leaf Green, the game just doesn't track time at all, meaning you also just can't evolve Eevee into Espeon or Umbreon in those games at all. Definitely a strange choice, and while this isn't as bad as it got in later games, it's another example of features being stripped down from Pokemon games for no real reason. As far as positives though, in terms of gameplay, there aren't really many complaints for Ruby and Sapphire. The Hoenn region has one of the more diverse Pokedexes with many different types of Pokemon to catch. Like, the first route of the game has a Dark-type Pokemon, which were so rare in Generation 2 and only available at night, which was also the generation that introduced the type. They also added plenty of Steel types, and the pace of Ruby and Sapphire in the Hoenn region just flows much better than it did in the Johto region. Generation 3 also started the focus on legendary Pokemon. While they existed in the previous two generations, they didn't really play much of a role in the story at all. Mew and Mewtwo were hinted at in Generation 1, and tracking down Mewtwo and catching it with the Master Ball was one of Team Rocket's ultimate goals, but it's never really explicitly said by Giovanni or anywhere else in the game, and in the Generation 2 Pokemon games, Lugia and Ho-Oh play no role in the story at all really, and act more like side quests later on in the game, which is still pretty cool, but in Ruby and Sapphire, the main focus is on the cover legendary Pokemon, Groudon and Kyogre, along with Rayquaza and Team Aqua and Team Magma, which follow you around up until the final badge of the game. This is something we see in pretty much every Pokemon game to this day, with the only exception really being Pokemon Legends ZA, not really focusing too much on Zygarde, but honestly, nobody really cares about Zygarde anyway. It's like this weird snake that got forgotten about in Generation 6, and also kind of forgotten about in its own game, Legends ZA. As for Fire Red and Leaf Green again, they were the first ever remake Pokemon games released, and they did a really good job. Even to this day, I think that Fire Red and Leaf Green are the best ways to play through the Kanto region, since the Generation 3 games as a whole aged pretty well. They even added the Sevi Islands as a post-game adventure, which wasn't as expansive as the post-game in Generation 2 adding the Kanto region basically, but still better than Red and Blue's post-game, and it was a whole new area rather than an old area, which was still very welcome, and not to mention, Fire Red and Leaf Green allowing you to play through Kanto with more modern mechanics like running, a bag that can hold more than 20 items, and a PC storage system from this century is also great. Then Emerald version enhanced Ruby and Sapphire a bit more, in a way that was better than what Crystal version did to Gold and Silver in my opinion, with the Hoenn Battle Frontier, which even to this day is looked at one of the best post-game areas, if not the best post-game area in all of Pokemon, and it's something that people still talk about in play to this day. This is a big reason why a lot of people actually consider the Generation 3 era to be the golden era. It built upon the existing Pokemon formula and modernized it, and was still able to keep up with newer games at the time that were released, as although Pokemon was in a bit of a downward trend during this period across the entire franchise, it was still leagues above any competitors, except for maybe like Yu-Gi-Oh!, which came kind of close as a rival in the early 2000s, but that was more so just with the cards and the anime, and not really the games. But you know which era isn't commonly looked at as the golden era? The modern era with the Nintendo Switch. Now, as it currently stands, every Pokemon game released after the Switch 2 release works on the Switch 1 as well, except for Pokopia, I guess, which is not a main series game anyway, so it doesn't really matter. This era is actually the longest era in terms of how much time has passed, since it started in 2018 and will go on until at least 2027, which is the longest era by at least 3 years. Heck, the entire Generation 4 era only lasted about 4 total years, to put things into perspective. You would think that since these are the newest games on the newest and most powerful hardware with the biggest budgets and biggest teams behind them, that it would be the best era, but in all honesty, the Switch era is just kind of okay, and my camera's about to die. I don't think these games are bad, and a lot of hate from Sword and Shield, for example, was exaggerated for clicks online, but hey, they still weren't that great. And to reiterate, I know Fire Red and Leaf Green were ported to the Switch too, but they don't count as the Switch era since those are literally Game Boy Advance games and not Switch games. Again, it's about the era of time, not the games the console can play. But to take things to the top for the Switch era, everything started with the Let's Go games. Another Generation 1 remake, but this time they were dumbed down a bit, and basically Pokemon at home with some sort of a story. It was cool to see Kanto in 3D, and although I had a great time playing through Let's Go Pikachu for the very first time, I kind of expected a bit more, to be honest. Like, this was the first main series Pokemon game on the Nintendo Switch, and the first mainline game to come out on a home console and not a portable only handheld console, which is a pretty big deal, and the sky was the limit, especially after seeing how games like Super Mario Odyssey and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild brought their respective franchises to new heights, as Breath of the Wild is seen as one of the best Zelda games of all time, if not the best Zelda game of all time. Mario Odyssey was the best 3D Mario game in a decade, but instead Pokemon got another remake game. And I know people don't like comparing Pokemon to Zelda. I'm not really trying to do that per se. I'm trying to make the point of Zelda had new heights on the Switch, and Pokemon kind of didn't start out too great. And that camera's dead now, so I'm only staring at the main cam. And don't get me wrong, at this point Pokemon had a great track record with remake games, especially with Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire we'll get back to later, but I feel like releasing this type of game as the first game on the console wasn't the best they could have done. It was a great callback to Generation 1 and definitely satiated all the Gen 1ers who got this game after playing Pokemon Go, but that's it. It's just fine, and that's kind of the theme of the Switch Pokemon games. I honestly wouldn't come out and say any Switch era Pokemon game is bad per se, but I wouldn't say any Switch era game is a top 3 Pokemon game in my opinion. Then the first new generation and new region game released for the Switch was Pokemon Sword and Shield. They were based on the UK, which was certainly a choice since the UK only exists in like TV, movies, and music, and while they did have some cool new stuff, they were just fine. First, there was the Wild area, which was like an open world experience and wild Pokemon to roam around in the overworld. They do that elsewhere in the game, which is a change some people didn't like, but I actually really welcomed it. As for the Wild area though, it felt more like a tech demo for what was to come compared to a new area, as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet basically is just one big wild area, and Sword and Shield just have a few wild areas in small parts of the game, and in the DLC, which acts as Sword and Shield's postgame. I know there's some weird stuff to do in Sword and Shield's postgame with like Swordward and Shieldbert, but with names like that, do you really even want to bother interacting with them? I remember when I first played Sword and Shield, I beat the whole game over the course of a weekend, as you do when your entire personality is basically Pokemon, and I remember thinking, I liked that game, and I liked it more than I liked Sun and Moon, but it definitely felt rather short, and a lot shorter than Sun and Moon. Like, they tried, and there were some cool features like raids, which are still in the game even to this day. By this point, the Pokemon formula was all figured out, and I think a big reason why newer Pokemon games don't feel as good as older ones is because of that. Part of it is nostalgia, actually a lot of it is nostalgia, but I feel like the Generation 1 Pokemon games were a blank slab of marble, and with each generation they slowly chipped at that marble to make a beautiful statue, but then they kind of ran out of marble to carve, so instead they added like hats and other random accessories to the statue to make it just not as good anymore. The base is still there and it's great, but the layers on top are questionable. And in the case of Scarlet and Violet, they added literal hats, as this generation's big battle gimmick is terrestrialization. This is where a Pokemon basically just turns to crystal and has a big hat with a type on it and changes types, which is like kind of cool, but also just not nearly as cool as previous battle gimmicks. Sword and Shield had Dynamax and Gigantamax, which were a weird watered down blend of Megas and Z moves from previous games, and out of all of these gimmicks, none of them were as cool as the iconic Mega Evolution. This was introduced in the previous era, the 3DS era, which I guess we'll talk about now. This of course spans from Pokemon X and Y released in 2013 to Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon released in 2017. Pokemon X and Y were the first Pokemon games for the 3DS, and they basically saved the console and Nintendo as a whole, as the 3DS was struggling after its initial launch in 2011. Pair that with the failure of the Wii U, and if it wasn't for Pokemon on the 3DS, there's a good chance Nintendo would look very different today. I also feel like the 3DS era started a huge shift in the Pokemon space online, where you saw a lot of YouTubers and streamers enter the scene, for example, as a lot of people just skipped Generation 5 and then came back to the series with the 3DS. But Pokemon X and Y were a big change to Pokemon. For starters, they made the game a lot easier, but still gave the player a lot of extra things to do. Some of the simplifications were welcome, as X and Y made breeding for competitive Pokemon a lot easier, super trading made it really easy to get competitive Pokemon for online battling, and overall, a lot of nice quality of life enhancements, which is kind of the theme of Pokemon ever since Generation 2, although some went a bit too far and made the game just way too easy. Pokemon X and Y are probably the easiest Pokemon games to date, mainly because important trainers like gym leaders often only use 3 total Pokemon on their team, and the Elite Four only uses 4 Pokemon as opposed to the usual 5. These games also introduced the mechanic where a Pokemon could survive a hit that would otherwise knock them out if they liked you enough, which overtuned friendship and just made it way too easy. Then again, by this point, the Pokemon formula was basically entirely figured out, so they had to look at more creative ways to expand the series like they did with Mega Evolution. This was basically their way of adding new evolutions to older Pokemon without actually adding new evolutions to older Pokemon, as Mega Evolutions don't have their own Pokedex number and they're only temporarily in battle evolutions that revert back to normal once the battle is over. To this day, it's still the coolest gimmick in all of Pokemon, and they would bring back Mega Evolution to the Generation 7 games, although it was kind of brushed to the side and left to the post-game, and before fully moving on to Pokemon Sun and Moon, I think it's worth mentioning that Pokemon X and Y basically had no post-game. There was the Looker missions and other cool optional things to do, like to raise your Pokemon and shiny hunt, and that's about it. But as for Pokemon Sun and Moon, these were probably the riskiest Pokemon games they ever made. Pokemon Sun and Moon completely changed the formula and forego the traditional gym system for island trials, and not all of the island trials were entirely battle focused. If you've ever played the game Yokai Watch, it's pretty clear that these games took heavy inspiration from them. Yokai Watch started to become incredibly popular in Japan by 2014 and saw international releases in 2015, and while the series is hanging from a thread nowadays and hasn't seen a Western release since like 2019, from the years of 2014 to 2016, it was a serious threat to Pokemon. I remember first hearing about Yokai Watch after seeing a picture of a mall in Japan, which had way more kids in line to meet Jibanyan, Yokai Watch's mascot, than Pikachu, and while many franchises have come and gone and claimed to be the Pokemon killer, Yokai Watch was the only one that even got a little close. Not super close, but way closer than any other series, especially at that time. I believe that's a big reason for Sun and Moon being so different, and while I do give them the short end of the stick, they actually did a lot for Pokemon. Now, I know I've been saying I need to replay Sun and Moon for a while now, and I will, but outside of maybe the Gen 2 games and their remakes, Sun and Moon, as well as Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, have the most extra stuff to do out of really any other Pokemon game. Although, to touch on the Ultra games a bit, I think they're the worst upper versions ever released. Did you know, by the way, that Emerald version and the Ultra games, for example, are technically called upper versions, by the way? But they basically just released Sun and Moon again a year later with a slightly different ending, a few small additions, and like, yeah, I know they've basically have been doing that since the Yellow version, but the Ultra games felt more unnecessary as there were 2 of them instead of just 1 game. I mean, I still bought both of them, but for a more casual fan, there was no reason to buy the Ultra games at all if you had Pokemon Sun and Moon, and if you've never played any of the Gen 7 games before, there's no reason to get Sun and Moon over the Ultra games. The 3DS era as a whole is the weirdest era for Pokemon, since I can easily see the argument for it being the best era. Okay, maybe not the best era, but second best. I can also see the argument for it being the worst era. I'll talk more about Pokemon Sun and Moon in my eventual Sun and Moon video for the 10th anniversary, but for a bit of a hype one for the 3DS era, there's Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I'll have to sit down and make a new tier list video soon, maybe if I run out of ideas soon, but Alpha Sapphire has to be in my top 5 or close to it. This might be controversial, but I think Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are the best remake Pokemon games, as while a lot of people might say it's Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they didn't really add anything much from Gold and Silver, and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire added a ton and even changed up the story. Like, don't get me wrong, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are amazing in their own right, but the Gen 2 games were already amazing, so they didn't really add too much on top of that. I think Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is the 3DS era's strongest leg to stand on, since they incorporated Mega Evolution so well into these games, and just enhanced Ruby and Sapphire, which were already pretty good, but still, no Battle Frontier like we saw in Emerald version. But hey, since the Gen 3 remakes were so good, maybe the Gen 4 remakes of Diamond and Pearl will follow suit and have like Dynamaxes and stuff, right? And no, they just did it. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is pretty much just a one-to-one remake of Diamond and Pearl, but for the Switch. A bit disappointing, and the art style isn't for everyone, but it's still Diamond and Pearl at its core. Now, going on another tangent to return to the Switch era, another flaw is it has the worst remake game. I don't think they're nearly as bad as people say, but definitely worse than the other 3 remakes. The Switch did also introduce the Legend games, which are vastly different than any other Pokemon game, and Legends Arceus is viewed as one of the best Pokemon games in a long time, but not enough to push the Switch era to the Golden Era in my opinion. But again, to wrap up the 3DS era as well as the Switch era, I guess, no, these really aren't the Golden Eras of Pokemon. And now we have my beloved, the DS era. I'm sure you guys saw this coming, and we were building to this all along, but the DS era of Pokemon is just peak. First, you have 2 screens for the first time, so that has to make the games twice as good. That's 2 different screens to look at pictures of your mother on, and while Diamond and Pearl weren't perfect, by this point I would say the core Pokemon formula was almost perfected. Every generation until Generation 4 tweaked the formula a little bit, and the big mechanic change Generation 4 added was the physical and special split for moves. Prior to Generation 4, every move of a certain type was either physical or special, with every single water type move, for example, being special, and every rock type move being physical, but now we have water moves like Waterfall, which is physical, and Surf, which is special, and then rock type moves like Ancient Power, which are special, and Stone Edge, which are physical. A lot of the moves I use on your mom are physical, sorry, but that one wasn't in the script, I promise. This had a big impact on Pokemon and made some Pokemon much more useful than before, although some were a bit worse, but it's still a welcome change that just makes a lot more sense and allows for more diverse Pokemon in terms of functionality. Now you can have a Ghost type Pokemon like Drifloon to focus on special type moves, which wasn't possible before as Ghost type moves used to be physical, and Grass type Pokemon like Torterra can also focus on physical moves, which were also special prior to Generation 4, and since Torterra, for example, is part Ground type, it can also use physical Ground type moves. And the Nintendo DS just had a lot of cool features like online connectivity, wireless local communication so you didn't need a weird bulky wireless adapter or a wire, and a return to time-based events. This was probably because of the release of Heart Gold and Soul Silver later on, which needed time-based events like the original's Gold and Silver. These remakes are very welcomed and are a modernized version of Gold and Silver that have all of the same features but add their own charm, like follow Pokemon and updated mechanics, they added back the Safari Zone, and they even expanded the Kanto region a little bit, which was condensed in Gold and Silver as we finally have a real Viridian Forest again, which wasn't the case in Gold and Silver. And then, of course, there's Generation 5, and oh boy, Generation 5. I don't really know where to begin with Generation 5. Black and White as well as Black and White 2 are some of the least played games, but they're still so great. I don't really know why people skip them, to be honest. A big complaint with some of the Generation 4 games is how slow they felt while playing, and a lot of that was probably struggles with Game Freak working on the DS for the first time, but by Generation 5, and with some help from the Nintendo DSi, they figured it all out and did an amazing job with the Generation 5 games. This was kind of like another soft reboot for Pokemon, as while it was controversial at the time, Black and White 1 only had new Generation 5 Pokemon in the main story. This was in an attempt to capture that magic of Red and Blue for the first time, where players wouldn't know most of the Pokemon before playing them really, and thankfully fans have come around to this today and kind of appreciate it now. I personally loved it at the time, just not knowing much of the Pokemon in the Pokedex outside of the starters and the cover legendaries. Then there's the sequels, Black 2 and White 2, which add back older Pokemon, and also just add on in Black and White 1, kind of like how Gold and Silver add on to Red and Blue. You see Unova in the future, you have a new protagonist, you have some new towns and gyms to face, and a lot of extra cool things to do throughout the game and in the post-game, a lot of which I didn't even know until the last couple of years, like FunFest missions and stuff, which makes Black and White 2 feel a lot like Gold and Silver. The DS era also covers the most ground when it comes to total games, outside of the Switch era maybe, which I haven't counted, as there are 9 total main series games to account for on the DS alone. A lot of people even commented saying that 2009 to 2012 was the golden era of Pokemon, which spanned from the release of Pokemon Platinum to Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. Platinum was also a very nice upgrade on top of Diamond and Pearl to make the game just make more sense and change up the Pokedex a little bit more to flow the game a lot better, and also fix the issue of Fantina's gym being so confusing by moving her up a bit. A small upgrade, actually a lot of small upgrades which add up, but a very welcome one, especially compared to the Ultra games. And then I want to shout out spin-off and side series games a bit, which we talked about a bit earlier with XD and Coliseum. I don't really talk about side series games on the channel too much, even though I've played most of them, but the DS era had a great run with spin-off games and side series games. There's a slight difference, like spin-off is like a totally different game, and side series has connectivity with main series like Coliseum, but there's the Mystery Dungeon series, for example, which is the most loved spin-off. The Ranger games were pretty cool, and I always see comments about Pokemon Conquest on the DS being so good, even though I never played it. And as a kid, I loved Pokemon Troze and put more hours to Pokemon Dash than anyone probably ever should. Other consoles just don't have the same level of spin-off games as we saw on the DS, as there are other good spin-off games on other consoles, like, you know, the N64 having Stadium, Stadium 2, and Snap, but I think the DS era had the best spin-off games. So you can easily say that the DS era is the golden era of Pokemon, and out of all of the eras we talked about, I think most people would agree with this. A lot of people also commented saying the golden era was from Generation 3 through Generation 5, which I also agree with, even though it's like a 10-year span. However, you can define an era however you like. You could even say that you think the golden era was like 2013 to 2019 because you loved everything from X and Y to Sword and Shield and they're your favorite games. You might get made fun of for saying that, but you sure can say that. I've seen some people talk about how they would consider the golden era to be from Platinum to Black 2 and White 2, and sometimes even Emerald versus Dark Gold and Soul Silver, which both still include the DS era to some extent. So yeah, that's it. The golden era is the DS era, Platinum, Johto, and Unova Supremacy. Although, again, most of this is just personal preference, but leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon. Shout out to all my cool Patreons, by the way. This video is coming out when I'm on vacation or after vacation, I don't know, so thank you. And also support me on Patreon for cool behind-the-scenes videos, I guess. And I'm putting the mic down and walking away, so bye.